Anja Zlotnik, thank you very much for coming with us to Brussels today. You're the director of the Population Division of UNDESA, the Economic and Social Affairs Department of the United Nations. So it's an honor to have you here and to talk with us about population, your field of competence for many years already. So could you, to start up, tell us, will the population in the world peak by the end of the century, or are we set to grow for many more years beyond 2100?
Well, the problem is that we don't know. The projections we've made today that are very not optimistic, but we decided they're courageous because we decided to make our projections up to 2100, and the truth of the matter is that we have great uncertainty about what the population of the world is going to be in 2100. And if I give you the ranges over which the population will vary, you will think that they're a bit of an invention, because we can say that the population could be anywhere between 6 billion and 16 billion in 2100, and that's a huge range. It's a range that is larger than what the population is today. So what we end up telling people is usually what the central path in those projections is, which is our median variant. And the median variant has a very interesting story behind it. It's a projection that produces 10 billion people at the end of the century. But in order to get there, it's super important that the fertility of the world, that is already quite low, will become even lower, and that every country will get to below replacement fertility long before the end of the century. So if we manage to achieve that, then you would get only this small growth of the population, 3 billion more. If many countries remained above replacement level for a long time, their population growth continues to add to the population, and besides add to the momentum, so that means it's difficult to stop their growth. And that could mean that the population of the world would be higher than the 10 billion that everyone cites.
How big would you guess is the possibility that the replacement level will, or that fertility in the high fertility countries of today will go down so fast that it goes below replacement level somewhere during this century?
Well, we don't have total measures of uncertainty, but unfortunately for the high fertility countries, the possibility of their remaining well above the replacement level seems still quite likely. And the reason being that it all depends on what happens in the next few decades, because these countries still have an average fertility of about 4.4 children per woman, which is still very high. And if they manage to get their fertility decline as fast as the other developing countries have done in the past, they will start really putting the brakes on their population growth early enough. If they don't, which is what we've been seeing lately, that their decline is much slower than one would want, then the potential for continued population growth increases, and it's more difficult to stop.
How can we do it? What should be done to get to the lower fertility that is needed?
Well, especially for those countries that are the ones that have the highest fertility, there are like 3 things that need to happen soon. One is that their governments have to commit to thinking that, yes, it's important to promote smaller families. And I say promote because it's impossible for governments to say to people, these are the number of children you have to have. They have to abide by human rights perspectives that mean that they should allow everyone to decide freely how many children they want to have. But there are ways of promoting smaller families, because we have found that most people are keen on giving their children the best future possible. And it's easy to to convince them or to make them aware that the fewer children they have, the better they can get their life for each child in the future. So that's one thing. The second thing is that aside from giving reasons why smaller families can do better, it's also important for governments to provide the means of having fewer families, and that means they have to make contraceptives easily available to women and men, mostly to women, and they have to provide the information on where to get them and how to use them to their population. It also helps to empower women by other means, and the other means are making sure that women have some opportunities for education, that they have opportunities for work outside the home, that they have legal rights in many aspects of life. All that, I think, is being done, and there's no controversy about this. There is more controversy about the provision of strong family planning services in many of these countries.
One thing that always surprises me is however much the emphasis on women's empowerment is justified, that there's so little emphasis on educating men to understand the importance of smaller families, of education for girls and all that.
Well, it's not a question of educating men in that importance, but in the education field, it's important to give gender information to children from very young ages. And by that, it means changing the views of certain societies and cultures about the status of men and women in the societies. And transmitting as early as possible in the education system the idea that in fact we live together in a society, and that the decisions that people make within families have to be decisions made in unison between the woman and the man that are usually the runners of families. That it doesn't work very well when only one of them is making decisions for the couple. And those values are not universal yet, and many people find them threatening, and that's why they're not being transmitted in many societies.
But isn't it a question indeed of almost trying to change some cultural values, even in a world where we accept cultural diversity as a value per se, but if that cultural diversity is keeping patriarchy going strong and so keeps the power in the hands of male decision makers to the detriment of the women, maybe there should be something done about that, or is that not something that the world community should involve itself in?
Well, it's difficult for the world community to involve itself in, because it has to happen at local level, and it has to have the buy-in of society, otherwise it's not going to happen. But the important thing is to make sure that people see why this is important, that it has good outcomes for both men and women. If it is not perceived as having those good outcomes, then it's not going to be accepted. And I think that some people have cited, for example, the very strong son preference that exists in certain societies, that is even leading to the sex selection of children before they are born. We have societies in which that has happened, and where things have changed because parents have realized that this is not making sense. Korea is one of them, where the sex ratio at birth had increased very much. That means there was great selectivity of male children to be born to the detriment of the female. But that has changed as the society itself is rebalancing its priorities. So there's hope that things can change, but usually the change in that sense cannot come from outside entirely. Maybe there's some effect from the international perspective, but it has to be internal. There are many things that societies that call themselves traditional are doing today that people did not do 500 years ago. So it's a falsity that we have to maintain things forever the same without changing, when the whole world is changing around us. But the processes by which these changes have to involve the willingness of the society itself. And it's not clear to know exactly when things change, what caused that change. Very often it's enlightened opinion leaders that start the change, and then the society sees that there's positive things happening because of that change, and that's when the change is embraced.
Looking at the figures of population growth and evolution or projections for the coming century, one would get the impression that the population problem really is concentrated in Africa. That's where the big explosion of population is expected to happen. Is that right to look at it that way? Or would you say that Africa will manage to come up with a solution on its own?
Well, the first thing is it right? The answer is there's some truth to it, because Africa has the largest number of countries that are high fertility countries. But it's not the only place where you have high fertility countries. Central America is another place. The Southern Asia is another place there at least, and some of the countries of the Arabian Peninsula. So there are several countries in the world that are not African that are facing the possibility of huge population growth if the fertility doesn't come down more rapidly in the future than it has come down in the past. The second thing is that in terms of the huge numbers, they're still in Asia. So the growth is not that huge, but the basis of the population is so big that they're adding lots of people to their population, especially in the Indian subcontinent. So the challenges in terms of population numbers exist in several regions of the world. And the main question is, one has hope for India, for example. Their economy is doing better. They have a middle class that is growing, but yet it's still a very unequal society in which, unless something is done to get the bottom half of the population to have a better future, it's not clear that the country is really going to develop very well. The African countries, there are so many with so many different regimes that one cannot give one recipe for all of them. But we know that as a group, their recent better economic performance is being undercut by the very rapid population growth they're having. So definitely it's a source of concern. It's not the only reason that they're not developing very fast.
Could the high fertility countries learn something from the Chinese prescription book? Either because there's two different Chinese stories in a sense. There's the People's Republic one-child policy, but then there's the example of Hong Kong before becoming part of the Republic, where the fertility was even lower than one child per family. So what is happening in the Chinese sphere that we could learn from for other countries?
Well, I would say there are two things that one can learn from China and India. One is that the economy matters. It's not just a question of population. Both China and India had changes in population that predated their economic development. And their economic development happened because they changed the way in which the economy was run. And that is essential. You have to have the right economic model, otherwise it doesn't work. It's not just a question of changing population trends that is going to change your economic outcome. And that means you need good governance regarding economics and the governance of the people. The other thing that both India and China show is that very often just telling the population what to do doesn't work. You need to have buy-in from the population. And that's what is not totally clear in the case of China, how much the population themselves bought into having smaller families, because the story we hear is that it was all imposed by the government. However, we who study population, we find that populations of Chinese origin in many other countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Hong Kong, Taiwan province of China, they all also reduce their fertility very quickly under very different government regimes. So one idea one has, and that happened in Europe also in the 19th century, is that the groups of population that reduced their fertility had something in common. And the most important things they had in common is they had the knowledge of how to do it. They had the sense that they could control their fertility and it was acceptable in terms of the family. And they had, at the end, the means to do it. They had access to those means. Once those three things happened, then people could make their own decisions, act on their decisions on how many children to have. And they did. So as you say, I think that the important story is of what happened to the Chinese origin populations outside China that also decided voluntarily to reduce their fertility. And that most countries can work on that, to make people have the means of deciding voluntarily to do whatever they want about their family size. And when you do that, universally we find that people decide to have fewer children than that their parents had had.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.